Good morning, everyone. Here are the notes for Chapter 7, and this is the second set of notes, so it's point 2, and this is on anaerobic respiration. This is Section 1 from Chapter 7. The standard that we are talking about with this whole chapter is the same one that we talked about in the photosynthesis chapter, Chapter 6. So this is to compare and contrast photosynthesis and cellular respiration in terms of energy transformation. So I want you to pause the video and look up the definition of cellular respiration. You can do this on Google or you can use your book and decide if both plant and animal cells perform cellular respiration. Go ahead and pause the video. Okay, great. I hope that you decided that both plant and animal cells, in fact, do cellular respiration. Cellular respiration is making large quantities of ATP using sugars. So we are going to walk through that process in this chapter. So here's an overview of cell respiration. My big yellow circle here is the cell, and these two things that you can see through, fermentation and glycolysis, they both happen in the cytoplasm of the cell, which is this yellow stuff. So that's why you can see through the boxes, because these things happen in the cytoplasm, just everywhere in the cell. So let me walk you through what happens. So let's take animal cells, for instance, because that's what we are. So we eat sugar, which is glucose, and that glucose goes into the cell, and the first thing that happens is glycolysis. And we'll talk about this in a little more depth in just a minute, what glycolysis is. What you get from glycolysis is 2 ATP molecules. So glycolysis is just the name of a set of chemical reactions. It's a process, a chemical process that happens in the cytoplasm. And the result is that you get a net gain of 2 ATP from glycolysis. From there, from glycolysis you get another molecule called pyruvate. You can also call this pyruvic acid because the pyruvate instantly turns into pyruvic acid. And pyruvic acid is never a good idea for the cell, so we need to do something with it. So these pyruvate molecules, or pyruvic acid, can do one of two things. It can go into aerobic respiration or fermentation. And it depends on the type of cell and the conditions that the cell is in, which pathway it takes. So let's talk about that. If there is oxygen present in the cell, and this is kind of a bad picture, but O2 is the chemical formula for the oxygen that we breathe because there are 2 molecules of oxygen. So I've got a couple of O2 molecules here. Again, not the best illustration, but you can imagine that these are oxygen molecules. If there's oxygen present in the cell, and if the cell contains a mitochondria, then the pyruvate will move into the mitochondria and aerobic respiration will happen. And if you think about this term aerobic, air has oxygen, so aerobic is generally a descriptor for oxygen. So an aerobic workout would be one that you're breathing very heavy and you're taking in a lot of oxygen. So here we go. Our pyruvate moves in to the mitochondria for aerobic respiration when there is oxygen present. During aerobic respiration, in the mitochondria, we're going to get out 36 ATP molecules. So that's pretty amazing. That's a lot of ATP. And this is a chemical process that happens in the mitochondria. And that's section 2 for chapter 7, so we'll go into more detail for this later. But for now, this pyruvate molecule that's made during glycolysis from glucose will move into the mitochondria and do aerobic respiration if there is oxygen present and a mitochondria present. So let's say that these things are not available. Let's say there's no mitochondria either. such as a prokaryotic cell like a bacteria. They do not have mitochondria, so they still have to do something with this pyruvate that quickly turns into pyruvic acid. And what they do is a process called fermentation. So fermentation, you've probably heard this word, and that's because there are two types of fermentation. There's lactic acid fermentation, and then there's alcohol fermentation. And alcohol fermentation is probably the one that you're familiar with. And this is how intoxicating beverages are made, through this process. Lactic acid is a byproduct of fermentation as well, and lactic acid is often used to make a lot of food products that we eat, such as cottage cheese and sour cream and many cheeses. So both of these processes are really, this one's part of your everyday life depending on the foods that you eat, and this one is very common as well. So there are two pathways that glucose can go. The first step is always glycolysis. After glycolysis, the pyruvate that is made from the glucose can then move into aerobic respiration and produce more ATP, or it can go through fermentation. Now, it's important to realize that fermentation does not give you any ATP. Notice that I only say it produces lactic acid or it produces alcohol. So why even do fermentation? And the reason is this pyruvate molecule quickly turns into pyruvic acid, which the cell has to deal with in some way. So fermentation is simply a way to get rid of that pyruvic acid that would otherwise build up in the cell and create sort of a toxic situation. So that's an overview of this whole chapter. In today's notes, we're going to talk about glycolysis and fermentation. And this is anaerobic respiration. If you notice, we don't need any oxygen to perform this function. So chapter 7.2, section 2, is about the aerobic respiration. So we'll cover that another time. Let's move on and talk about glycolysis. Take a minute, pause the video, and look at this diagram. Alright, so you've taken a minute and looked at the diagram. What you notice is you have a 6-carbon glucose, and that's what these circles represent, carbons. And we know that glucose is in a circle, it's not in a chain, but for the sake of making it simple, that's how they've drawn it. It requires 2 ATP molecules to start this reaction, so it actually uses 2 ATP. And it adds those phosphates from the 2 ATP onto the glucose molecule, and then it breaks apart. So now we have 2 3-carbon molecules, each with a phosphate group on it. Now we add in a free-floating phosphate, and the molecule looks like this. We add NAD+, and it removes the phosphates. Here we add NAD+, and it removes the phosphates. And in the process of removing those phosphates, it attaches them to 2 molecules of ADP, which then makes ATP. So in the end, we get 4 ATP molecules. If you look down here, 4 ATP molecules are made in glycolysis, but we used up 2 of them in the beginning, remember up here? So you end up with a net gain of 2 ATP through this process. Also notice this pyruvate, a 3-carbon molecule. So this pyruvate will quickly turn into pyruvic acid. So this is pretty detailed. And again, just like in the photosynthesis chapter, this is a chemical process, and you haven't had chemistry, so you don't need to memorize this process. Here's what you do need to know. You need to know that the reactants are glucose, 2 ATP molecules, and you also need NADH plus molecules in order to form the pyruvate and the ATP at the end. The products, you get pyruvate, you get H2O, you get a little bit of water, it just becomes part of the cytoplasm. You get 4 ATP that can be used by the cell, and you get NADH, which that is listed down here. And these move on to the electron transport chain in the mitochondria. The pyruvate moves to the Krebs cycle in the mitochondria or to fermentation. So these four things are the products. Glucose and pyruvate are the things that you need to know the most. These are the most important. Glucose goes in, pyruvate comes out. The other stuff here will make it easier for you to understand what happens in fermentation, and it will make it easier to understand what happens during aerobic respiration. But pyruvate and glucose are the most important. So pause the video and take a look, and what might these things all have in common? I hope that you remembered that I mentioned fermentation earlier. All of these things are made through the process of fermentation. So sour cream, yogurt, even soy sauce, and pickles are made through the process of fermentation as well, including sauerkraut. I'm not a huge fan of sauerkraut, but some of you may like it. Actually, it's good on a Reuben, and that's about it, a Reuben sandwich. So let's talk about fermentation. There are two types, which we mentioned earlier. There's the lactic acid fermentation and alcohol fermentation. Now, lactic acid fermentation is usually performed by animal cells, such as human muscle cells, and microorganisms. And what they do is they turn the pyruvic acid that's formed during glycolysis into lactic acid. And this lactic acid can make cheeses, yogurt, sour cream, all of those types of things. If your human muscle cells go through this process, then you get a buildup of lactic acid. And this is actually what makes your muscles sore after a really hard workout. So think about that for just a minute. You're working out and you're breathing hard. Let's say, you're doing a run or a swim, and your coach, or you may have heard someone say, feel the burn. As your muscles start using large quantities of ATP to make you move and do the sport or the activity that you're doing, when they run out of oxygen, they still have to get rid of the pyruvate that has turned into pyruvic acid. And so it will actually go through lactic acid fermentation. And that lactic acid building up in your muscles is what makes them sore. Now, you're constantly breathing, so you don't do lactic acid fermentation 100% of the time. But at the moment, if you're producing lots of pyruvate and you don't have a lot of oxygen and it's not getting moved into the mitochondria, your muscles will do this, and that's what makes them sore. Kind of crazy, huh? The lactic acid, if you're wondering why it goes away after a couple of days, your body will actually push the lactic acid out of your cells into the fluid around your cells, and it's cleaned up by your lymphatic system. And it takes a day or two to do that, sometimes more depending on how much you've worked out. Alcohol fermentation is pretty similar, except our muscle cells cannot do alcohol fermentation, which is probably a good thing. Wouldn't want a buildup of that in your system. Performed by some microorganisms, and it turns that pyruvic acid into alcohol. And it's the ethyl alcohol which is used to make alcoholic beverages. So that's the end of the notes for this section. You should be able to answer these questions.